You're listening to Interactive Wrestling Radio, featuring the Interactive Interview, courtesy of WrestlingEpicenter.com.
Welcome back to Interactive Wrestling Radio. Joining me on the Newsmaker line is a gentleman who is now going to get, I believe, his first action figure. And I'm excited to have him on to discuss that and amongst other things. He is the former WWE star Phantasio, but probably better known to everybody, known as Spellbinder, or you might know him as Del Rios. Are you with me, sir?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Actually, that's going to be my third action figure.
Your third? Wow, cool.
Yes, sir.
So when did the other ones come out?
The other ones came out a number of years ago. WWE made a classic. I don't know if you...
oh, you're kidding.
It was a classic. Yeah, and it was a little bit bigger figure, and it was awesomely made, and it came with a mask.
That's really cool. I'm going to go on eBay for that one.
Yeah, and then of course they made the Slam Buddy.
Yep.
And now Rush Figures contact me, and they were interested in making, because those were Phantasio. Rush Figures was interested in making a Spellbinder, and I said sure, because I own and trademarked the name Spellbinder character.
That's very cool. And Spellbinder is what I know you best as. I told you on Facebook, but I'll tell you now, every time I hear that name, I can hear Dave Brown's voice. I hear Dave Brown saying, and Spellbinder, and for some reason it just, that stuck in my head, but there you go.
You know, Dave's a good guy, and I remember talking to him a lot of times before the show or before any time at the Mid-South Coliseum, and even when we were in the back, you know, he wouldn't say, "Hey, Dale." He would go, "Oh, there's the Spellbinder." So he just liked saying the name.
He seemed to. He seemed to really like you too. It seemed to come through on screen. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We were good friends.
Very cool. Yep, and he's been on AEW TV in the last couple of years. He got an opportunity to call when they were in the Tennessee area, so that was pretty cool that they remembered him and brought him in. And I got to tell you, he actually brought a little bit of class to the announce team over there, so that was cool to see.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I remember that.
Awesome. So another thing that happened to you recently, we'll talk a little bit about your fairly recent, about a month ago you got in the ring, but Jim Cornette mentioned you, and it came up on YouTube, and I saw it. They asked about you, and that came up. That was pretty cool, and I thought, you know, it's really weird that I book a guy for an interview, and all of a sudden Jim Cornette's talking about him. So it's kind of weird that happened.
It was funny because I heard the interview, and he said he didn't know Phantasio, but then the Spellbinder came up, and he went, "Oh, yes." See what I mean? So Spellbinder, of course, you know, was much more popular than, of course, Phantasio. He had a way longer run for years, you know, and so I would have to say most wrestling fans in the South know me as the Spellbinder. But still, I go up north, you know what I mean, and Phantasio, however you want to pronounce it, you know, people just they gravitated toward the character, you know what I mean? So, I mean, definitely. The magic thing helped it a lot.
Yeah, and that was kind of my first question. Which came first, your love of magic or your love of pro wrestling?
Well, my love for magic. I was a magician growing up, and actually, Jeff Sheridan and Jeff McBride, two magic legends, Hall of Famers, were my teachers. Jeff Sheridan actually taught David Copperfield, and Jeff McBride was a huge, huge star and opened for a lot of celebrities, Elton John, Diana Ross, you know, people like that. And we were pretty good friends. So I grew up learning magic. You know, my first love was magic, and I wanted to be, you know, one of the world's greatest magicians, you know, and I still love magic to this day. Then I started working out in bodybuilding and started competing as a bodybuilder, but still loved magic. You know, now some people might have heard it before, but you know, I got into wrestling because my younger brother, you know, he said, "Oh man, you should be a wrestler." And you know, I wasn't a big fan of WWF at the time, but he was. Mm-hmm. And I took him to the Madison Square Garden in New York, and one of the security guys. I was sitting in one of the front rows with my brother, and he walked by and bent over and said, "Hey, what are you doing out here? You should be in there."
Huh.
And my brother looked at me and said, "See, I told you." I mean, I was a pretty big guy. I was 6'3", 280 pounds. So just to humor my younger brother, I got tights, put them on, and Jeff McBride had a pantomime act in which he painted his face and did magic as a pantomime. And I thought, that'd be a good idea, but I'd just be a big, huge, pantomime wrestler with magic. And I put it all together. The name was mine. Everything, I owned everything. And that's why when Vince signed me, he changed the name because he wants to own everything. And I even told him, I said, well, you can use it if you want to. I'll sign where. But no, he likes to own everything. So we come up with Phantasio.
Very cool. And you ended up probably making your biggest bones in Memphis, Tennessee, USWA, later on PPW. Yes. But, I can tell we talked a little bit off air. You're from Brooklyn. Obviously, it's got to be a little bit of a culture shock to head down south. How did you take to moving down to Memphis and being part of the Southern style? Was that tough to deal with, to get used to?
No, it wasn't. To be totally honest with you, it wasn't. I was so green. The reason, my first professional match was a tryout at Monday Night Raw, a dark match at Monday Night Raw. It was in the Manhattan Center in New York City. And I was green, man. I knew how to lock up, do a body slam. Maybe I did a few moves. But what captivated, was I was in unbelievable shape. I was a big guy. And, of course, I came out and I had a magic cane that blew fire. And, I pulled the mask off my face and had the stuff coming out of my mouth. And it was just entertainment. And Vince loved it. But he after the show, one of the agents came over and said, "Hey, don't leave. Vince wants to speak to you." And I said, "Sure." So Vince talked to me and said, "Hey, we're interested in talking to you about it. So we'll have J.J. Dillon call you." J.J. called me a few days later and said, "Look, we're interested in signing you, but we want to send you to Memphis, Tennessee to have you work and get experience because you right now you just don't have the experience." And I said, "Sure." So it was easy because I was very athletic and I listened. You know what I mean? That's one thing about me. I wanted to learn and I listened, and I just happened to hit it off with Jerry Lawler's son, Brian Christopher, and he was into working out. So we kind of, he would go to the gym with me and we work out hard, and then I'd work a match and he'd watch it and tell me, "No, don't do this, do that. You should do it this way." So it came along pretty easy.
Very cool. And I've been watching clips to prepare, and one of the clips that's on YouTube is when we first saw the Spellbinder in USWA. You went from being Del Rios to the Spellbinder with Skull Von Krutz, who ended up being Big Vito, for those who remember. Yes. Big Vito out there. Yeah, that was a pretty cool. Burt Prentice was there as well. It was cool how it came off, but was that a fun experience to kind of play with people's minds like that? And like, okay, off comes the hood, and now the face is painted and everything looks cool.
Believe it or not, I was doing Del Rios because Jerry Lawler came up to me. He was the booker of USWA and came over and said, "Hey, I'm going to take this gimmick off you because you don't have a lot of experience. You're going to kill it off. So I'm going to let you wrestle as Del Rios for a while until you get some more experience." So about 8 months later, I'm working that's one thing about the territory in Memphis. You work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, twice. So I was learning on the road and working every day. And he came Matt, he was from, I wanted to say he's from Portland, Oregon. Matt
Bourne.
Matt Bourne. Okay, so Matt Bourne, believe it or not, came in and he was trying to do a magic gimmick. He came into Memphis. Really? And
because he had been Doink, right? So he was, yeah.
He had done Doink, but had gotten fired for whatever reason.
Right,
And
right.
then they had hired Ray McAnally as Doink, and he's from Jersey. But I remember Matt Bourne
He's
coming
from
in.
my hometown, actually. Doink the Clown. He was from Richfield, New Jersey. That's where I was
Right.
born and raised. There you
Exactly.
go. Yeah.
Real good guy, you know. And I met him up here because he came to the territory and we worked together, and then we met in New York as well. But Matt Bourne came in and he was doing a magic gimmick. Not very well, I might add, because he wasn't a magician. So apparently he had went to the magic shop and bought a few different, little things, and thought, okay, I'll do the magic character. King came over to me. Jerry Lawler came over to me and says, "Hey, man, Matt's trying to do a magic gimmick," and I just said, "Well, that's my gimmick. Number one, I came up with it." And he goes, "All right, well, let's get ready to turn you back to the Spellbinder." But see, Vito, who was already a friend of mine, him and I went to Johnny Rod's School of Wrestling together.
Ah.
And he was actually the one that helped me prepare for the tryout, for the Monday Night Raw tryout. He told me, Del, to be honest with you, you're not ready. You're not ready. And I said, yeah, but I got to go for it because I got this opportunity. So
it's an opportunity of a lifetime.
Right. And I said, who else? Who would say no? I told him. He says, no, you're right. So we did it. Anyway, I talked to Jerry Lawler. I talked to, who else? Brian. I talked to a few people and told them, listen, man, I got a friend of mine who wants to come in. And sure. So they started booking him. They flew him in, and he started working. I went to Vito, and I was working him I was doing an angle with him as Del Rios. And I says, hey, V, listen. So King told me we need to come up with something. We need to come up with something for me to turn it back into the Spellbinder. So Vito and I put that whole skit together, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So believe it or not, we went to King's house. We went to Jerry Lawler's house on a Thursday, me, Vito, and Burt Prentice. And King was the type of guy, he didn't want to hear no stories, no nothing. Show him what we got. You know what I mean? So we did that whole skit for him in front of him in his living room, and he loved it. So he goes, okay, we'll do it on TV this Saturday. You know what I mean? Which, is live. It wasn't taped or nothing like that. So we had to get it just right. And Vito worked on it. We practiced it a few more times, and boom, we hit it right on the nose. I thought it came out pretty well.
It did, and that's such a lost art of pro wrestling, was the studio style. And they tried to do it a few years ago with the NWA, and didn't last long term. The pandemic kind of probably sidelined
Knocked it out.
Yeah, exactly. But it was so cool because it was so easy to tell stories with that format. And I wish it was more like that now, because sometimes I watch now and I don't know why the hell this guy's mad at this guy. And you think, if it was studio style, maybe they would make more sense.
Well, that's why, to be honest with you, and they called it the Memphis style, the Memphis Wrestling. And, and it wasn't just Memphis. It was just wherever in the South, anywhere. And you told a story. And that's one of the reasons that I think people loved wrestling. There was a storyline. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's soap operas going on for 30, 40, 50 years. And that's because of the storyline. And it doesn't exist anymore. I don't see it. It's not the same. And I don't know. I think they tried to, evolutionize whatever, and they just don't, they don't tell a story. They just do a bunch of moves, and people, okay, whatever, so.
That seems to be what it is now. It's like watching a Cirque du Soleil, watching guys do flips and stuff.
Right.
I'd rather see a story, but.
Well, yeah, you know what? I get that all the time whenever I'm making an appearance or I'm somewhere, people go, man, wrestling is just not the way it used to be. I'm not going to knock what's going on. I hope they're all successful. I hope they make, good money and that's good. But, it's just not the same. It's not the same at all.
Well, you mentioned some of the guys that you got to work with in Memphis, and if you look at the roster of guys that you worked alongside, the likes of Jeff Jarrett, the likes of Sid Vicious, the likes of Doug and Eddie Gilbert. I mean,
yeah. And you're talking about those. see, those are wrestling legends.
Mm-hmm.
Those are wrestling legends. You know what I mean? Because those guys can, and I said it for years. Those guys can have a wrestling match with a mop, and people would still react. You know what I mean? And they, every one of those people that you said there told a story. I remember. Listen, man, I remember in my young first year in Memphis, I rode with Eddie Gilbert about 200 miles somewhere, and he was one of the most in-depth guys you've ever talked to in wrestling. I learned a lot with him and Doug Gilbert. You know what I mean? Of course, Jerry Lawler, because I drove with him everywhere as well, and his son Brian, who was way, way, way ahead of his time. Mm-hmm. And you know, that was an unfortunate story with him, but all those guys, man. You know, Rock and Roll Express. You know, even the guys like Pat Tanaka. I'm talking about guys that worked for years.
Yep, there you go. And you mentioned Eddie Gilbert was as a kid, because I'm 43 now, so I was a kid when he was around, but
right.
You kind of were intrigued by him because you could tell like there was another level, and obviously Eddie Gilbert was a student of the game, but also a student of Jerry Lawler's. He idolized the King.
Yes.
So, and what better guy to idolize than the guy who was literally the king of the of the territory? So
if he liked you, you learn.
There you go. And I mentioned Dave Brown earlier. I'm going to mention another guy that unfortunately is not with us. And I mentioned so many of these guys, and as I do it, I'm realizing this guy's gone and that guy's gone. It's so sad. But of course, I'm talking about Lance Russell. Lance Russell was there.
Yeah.
And he seemed to make Banana Nose. He seemed to make it so easy for you guys when you were doing promos. Was he an easy guy to work with? And
easy. He was the best. Him. I'm going to tell you something. Dave was good, but there was a certain line with Dave you couldn't mess with. You could, he would tell you. But Lance was easy. I mean, whatever you wanted to do, you know what I mean? And the thing about Lance, his presence, because already he was a legend as an announcer, you knew where not to cross. You know, you had certain amount of respect for him. I don't care who you were, whether you were a top heel, or a baby face. It didn't matter. I saw the top heels, even, what's his name? He's in jail now, Billy Jack Haynes, who would say whatever, anytime. Very respectful when lads.
Wow.
Sid Vicious was the same way. I was for sure the same way. It didn't matter who it was, whether Doug as a heel, Eddie as a heel, Billy Joe Travis, Buddy Landell. I'm talking about, these were the top heels when they came in, and would say anything, and they all had the utmost respect for Lance.
Absolutely. You got the opportunity. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I stepped on you. Go ahead.
I said they're not and God rest their souls. A lot of guys we're talking about aren't with us anymore. Sid, not Buddy Landell. Yeah. Tracy Smothers, all these guys.
Yeah, best right hand of the business would be Billy Joe Travis. I mean, there's a lot of guys that are just.
Yes, man. Yeah, it was like one day they were here, the next day they're gone. You know what I mean?
Where the time? Oh, yeah, it's the darkness of the business, but it's also so much time has gone by, and it doesn't feel like it has. It's so weird.
Exactly. You're 100% right. So a lot of times, there's people come. A lot of times, people come to me whenever I'm doing an appearance or I'm somewhere, and they'll say, do you remember the time you worked with this person and did this, and that? And I'm thinking, oh my God, yeah, I do remember, because I do remember a lot of the stuff, and it doesn't seem like it was that long ago, man. But
yeah,
time flies.
Well, it's been almost 30 years since you had the opportunity to go on WWE TV.
Right.
It was cool. I watched the match back. Like I said, I did my preparation for this. I watched it back probably for the first time in a couple of decades. And, man, it was really cool. And it's really cool now knowing a lot of what goes on behind the scenes, hearing Jim Ross call it and Gorilla Monsoon call that match for you. It was a little more kid-friendly than the stuff you were doing on Memphis TV. But
Well,
what did you think? Yeah.
Yeah, and because they wanted me, to be a little bit more babyface. They wanted me to be babyface. And, man, I remember having that match. I had a bunch of matches before that. They weren't televised. They were all dark matches. I did a lot of house shows with WWF and WWE. I did some more TV tapings as well, but they were never released for whatever reason. I do remember that time we were in that match that was televised was in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. I'll never forget that because I was one of the last matches and people were tired already. Mm-hmm. But when I came out, they kind of livened up with the magic and stuff like that. And when I got to the back, I remember, rest in peace, Mabel from Men on a Mission.
Yes, sir.
Said, man, hey, man, that was great, dude. Today you got the people going again. People were tired, so you got them going again. And I was like, cool. You know what I mean? I remember, what's his name? From Puerto Rico.
Savio Vega.
Yeah, Savio Vega. He came up to me and said, oh, man. He said, he told me in Spanish. He said, man, that character is going to be on top. It's going to be on top. And then I had, I really don't want to mention his name. I don't want people to think that he was, but I had another guy who was regularly on the show and on TV a lot come up to me and he goes, you want something, Dale? And I said, yeah, what's up? He said, I think you're a little bit too good for your own good.
Oh.
And I didn't understand what he meant by that. I was like, what are you talking about? What do you mean I'm too good for my own good? And I mean, it was, who knows what that meant? You know what I mean? I didn't pay it too much mind. See, at the end of the day, I was working every day, whether it was in the Memphis territory or was it for a house show in WWF, WWE / so I was working 6 days a week, so it didn't matter to me at all. And I was getting 2 checks, one from Vince and one from the territory in Memphis, one from Jarrett Promotions. So it didn't matter. You know what I mean? I didn't care. I just say this to you. Like one time, I ran into we were in TNA, and I was doing a shot for Jeff at TNA, and I saw Scott Hall over there, and we talked for a few minutes, and he said, you know what I always liked about you, Dale? And I said, yeah, what's up? He says, you're not a mark. You know what I mean? And I said, yeah, you're right. I'm not a mark. You know what I mean? I wasn't. I could just tell you this. I was the very, very first developmental for the WWF.
Yep.
Okay, before NXT, before OVW, before the Memphis and all that, I was the very first. They started paying me and they sent me to Memphis to learn to wrestle. I wasn't asking people, oh man, when are they going to call me up? When am I going back up to WWF? I never did that. Never. I watched people come and go. I watched, you named the developmentals that came in and left and got let go and got fired and got, released or whatever. Mm-hmm. All of them were like, man, I'm wondering when they're going to call me back up. They said they only sent me here for a few weeks or a few months. Man, no, you know what I mean? That was their biggest downfall. The minute you start running your mouth, your time's ticking.
You had the opportunity to be kind of the guiding force, I felt like, on TV anyway, behind Brackus. And it felt like you were kind of maybe put there to be his mentor, maybe to be the guy that helped him along. Right. Was it cool to be trusted to do that and to be the guy that, let's help this guy along?
Yes. Well, what they had let me know. They said, listen, remember, I was a bodybuilder. So when Brackus' real name was Atom Albrecht, and I knew who he was because he was an IFBB pro, and he was highly touted as a bodybuilder. So Brian calls me and says, "Hey, my dad called me and they said that they're going to bring in guy from Germany, bodybuilder, and my dad said he's going to tag him up with you so that you can help him and stuff." And I said, "Yeah, that's fine. I don't care." And so when I walked in the TV that morning, well, guess who it is? It's Akamova. I looked at him and I said, "Whoa, okay." I said, "Hey, man, he didn't speak very good English at all, So, I told him, I said, "Hey, we're going to be working together and, we'll do this." He didn't even know how to lock up, So I took most of the match and let him in for the heat and then let him do a power finish, like maybe a power slam or something like that. And he, and in turn, we went to the gym and I learned a lot of more bodybuilding and nutrition and stuff. But again, he fell victim to that. He kept wondering when he was going to go back up to WWF. And I told him a few times, I said, "Man, just be happy that you're here and you're getting a nice check." And this and that. But, he was in a totally different situation. He was married. He had 2 kids, that type of thing. So, but I've seen it happen over and over again. See, I was smart. I kept my mouth shut and got a check for a long, long, long time just to keep, be signed with them for as long as it did.
Very cool. One of the guys I did an interview with was James Beard. I've interviewed a lot of the guys we talked about here, but James Beard was a guy who came into USWA towards the end, and
he Texas. Was he from Texas?
He was Dallas territory for sure.
Yes.
But he came into Memphis, and he kind of came in right at the same time that everything hit the fan with the Memphis territory. And unfortunately, USWA ultimately closed up. Was that a scary moment for you professionally, because you had basically set up shop there for quite some time to see it kind of just go up?
I was, to be honest with you, no, it wasn't scary at all to me. To be honest with you, I saw it coming, because that was, you see, Jeff Jarrett and Jerry Lawler sold it to a gentleman in Ohio that had nothing to do with wrestling. He had some money. And we talked about doing action figures from us and all this and that. And I said to myself, "Oh, this ain't going to work." I said, because this guy knows nothing about the business, and he's thinking that he's buying, a smaller WWF. And I said, no. And then somehow or another, they started bringing guys in from Dallas, which was James Beard. They brought in a couple of workers from not Dallas, Texas. To me, at the time, I didn't know they were from Dallas. I didn't know where they were from. But they brought in a few guys. And James, who was a nice guy, was a referee. He did the refereeing. But then he started calling himself a matchmaker, and I said, no, that's not going to work. And then one week, it was kind of a standoff. And then, so Jerry Lawler called me and he says, "Hey, so, something may happen tomorrow at TV, so be ready, because, they may try to say that, they own the company, but they don't own the company. We own the company." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" So I remember calling Brian and saying, "Hey, man, what?" He went, "Man, I don't know." But anyway, I showed up. Everything was quiet, but you could see there was 2 sides. One side was, his name was Mark Seltzer. Seltzer.
Oh, that's the name. Yep, I remember the name. Yep.
Yeah, Mark Seltzer. And then, of course, you had Jerry Lawler and the guys on his side. Which we're gonna be more dominant because we live there. These guys were coming in from Texas. So, and after that, I'm gonna tell you where it ended. So we had USWA was on for 20 years on Saturday morning at 10 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now this was for a fact. Memphis, the city of Memphis, would not wake up. There was nobody in the streets till 11:30 because the show was a 90-minute show, and it was from 10 to 11:30. So while that show was on, everybody was glued to their seats in their home because that's how it was for years. Now, at the end of the day, Jerry Lawler made an announcement that the show was going to be moved from 10 a.m. to 12 midnight. That was the beginning.
Midnight.
Yeah, there you go. That was the beginning of the end. Nobody stays up. Nobody stays up midnight on a not in the Bible Belt. They got to be in church the next day on Sunday.
Oh boy.
Yes. So that killed it.
Yeah, I believe it. And I know that there was other attempts. Corey Macklin tried some stuff with Memphis Primetime and things like that, but never quite caught the same fire as when USWA ruled Memphis.
No, Power Pro was pretty popular. Mm-hmm. Power Pro, Randy Hales came up with Power Pro a little while later, and they had some really excellent ratings because they had gotten the 10 o'clock slot, and that went on for a couple of years. And of course, I did Randy's Power Pro and stuff, and that went on till it, of course, it ran its course as well.
Very, very cool. Well, we kind of talked about it, the dark side of wrestling, and you mentioned a few names that have a mystique about them. And frankly, I'm surprised they haven't done a dark side of the ring on it. I don't want to, put you on the spot, but
no,
Jerry Lawler, I've interviewed him before. It was before Brian passed, but he's said in interviews he'll never believe that Brian took his own life. What is your thoughts on the passing of Brian?
I'll tell you what. When Brian was the best man at my wedding. I was the best man at his wedding. We were inseparable. And as a matter of fact, one time him and I got into an argument because we were like brothers. We'd argue about some stupid thing. And Jerry was in the back seat. And I said, that's it, man. I ain't riding with you no more. I said, I ain't messing with you. And then Brian goes, that's fine. I don't care. This and that. And then Jerry, from the back, he goes, oh, man, you two shut up. You're two peas in a pod. And we all just started fell on the floor laughing. You know what I mean? So I mean that was my best friend, man. Matter of fact, we were like brothers. But and it's not their fault. I'm not going to. Brian, I remember having conversations with Brian for hours at a time. Man, we would be either driving from one city to another or flying. It didn't matter. We spent more time on the road in each other's company than we did with our own wives. And he was a super, super intelligent guy. His whole demeanor, everything changed when he went full-time to WWE, WWF. You know what I mean? And it's not their fault. I do not blame that company for anything because we as men do whatever we want to do. You know what I mean? But I remember his wife at the time coming to me because at that time there was two shows going on, the B team and the A team. So I was on the other side, and at the same time I was still doing Memphis back and forth, and he would go he was on the A team, but we all met one time and did Memphis at the. It wasn't the FedEx Forum. It was the Pyramid at the time. It was the biggest arena in Memphis. And I remember I was on the show. He was on the show. Rock was on the show. The Dudleys and all the guys were on there. But I remember this is what happened. I remember something was wrong because I did like about an eight shot deal with them. I had to work Mark Henry every night.
Yeah, I was just looking at the results, and it's like Mark Henry. So
yeah, I worked Mark Henry, and I worked Mark Henry in Chattanooga, Nashville, Little Rock, Memphis, at the pyramid that we were doing. And I remember I called Brian and said, "Hey, you're on that show in Chattanooga," and he goes, "Yeah, we're here." And I said, "All right, I'm on my way." Me and Downtown Bruno were driving up. Me and Harvey Whippleman.
Harvey Whippleman, yeah.
Yes. So him and I, we were driving up. I said, "All right, I'll meet you in Charlotte." So I can't remember who he was riding with, but me, him, and Dwayne were like tight, super tight, because we all trained together, all three of us. But then I got to Chattanooga, and Dwayne wasn't riding with him anymore. And I thought that was strange. I said, man, that's funny. But anyway, Brian jumped in the rent-a-car with me and Bruno, and he rode with us the rest of the tour. And I would wonder. I was like, man, and I saw Dwayne there every night because he was working. He was working undertaking in a coffin match, and there was a few times I had him alone, and then all of a sudden somebody came in. But I wanted to ask him. I said, "Man, what's up? How come you're not riding?" And then the crazy thing was, about a month later, I was in the gym, and Brian's wife came in the gym, and I just talked to her. I talked to her for a few minutes, and she said, "Hey, let me ask you a question." I said, "What's up?" She says, "What happened between Brian and Dwayne?" I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "They're not riding together anymore." I said, "Man, I'll be honest with you. I was wondering that myself." So what it was Dwayne never got high or drank or did anything like that. Brian started hanging out with the other guys, like what's his name, Sean Waltman, and all the other guys. And again, I don't have nothing against Sean and all those guys. Those guys always treated me with respect. They were super cool, but they did their thing. You know what I mean? One thing about me, to this very day, I've never gotten high. I've never drank. I've never done anything. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a saint. I did my fair share of anabolic steroids, you know what I mean, to walk around at 300 pounds, but never did any recreational drugs or anything. And, Brian got into that scene. The only thing about Brian was Sean and all these other guys, and I don't mean to keep mentioning his name, but there was a bunch of the guys, they can deal with it. You know what I mean? Brian couldn't. He just got way out of hand. And I don't blame none of those guys. And those guys, I mean, a lot of those guys are still here. They're alive, but Brian just went south. He went south. First of all, those guys can still work. And those guys, they had their jobs way longer than Brian. Brian got fired. Matter of fact, Brian got fired twice from WWE. You know what I mean? So,
oof.
Yeah, he went downhill, and as much as I loved him to death and stuff like that, I had taken a break from wrestling. I had been doing it for 18 years, and I started competing as a bodybuilder again, and I was working as a personal trainer and making a lot of money because I was prepping people for bodybuilding shows and competitive, different things. And Brian wasn't doing well. He was doing, little small shows here and there, but nothing. So I remember making sure Brian had whatever it was he needed and stuff. And it went too fast. Just one day, my wife and I, we were coming home from dinner. We got home. It was about 9:00, and Kevin, Brian's brother, calls me and he says, "Brian tried to kill himself." I said, "What?" I remember saying, "All right, I'm on my way. Where you at?" He said, he said, "Where you?" I said, "Where you at?" And he said, "I'm here at the Med," which was the Regional 1, which is big time trauma. They had, they sent the helicopter from where Brian was to that hospital. And I said, "All right, I'm on my way." I remember telling my wife, I said, "Hey, get dressed." I said, "We got to go." She said, "What happened?" I said, "Brian tried to hang himself." She went, "Oh my God." And she threw all her stuff on, and we ran down there, and man, We got to the hospital around 10 o'clock, 9:45. They had us waiting in the downstairs. King couldn't get there because he was stuck in Charlotte and couldn't get a flight out. And man, we went into they let us come inside at 2:30 in the morning to see him. First, his mom came in, and then the first person she said that she wanted to come in the room was me, and then my wife, and then I think Jerry Lawler's girlfriend at the time, and then so it was about 3-4 in the morning. My wife was exhausted, so I told Brian's mom, I said, "Hey, I'm gonna take my wife home, take a shower, eat something, and then come right back." So by the time I got back, King was in the room, this and that. But man, Brian wasn't going to live, and I knew it from the first minute that I walked in that room. I knew. I said, "Nah." I said, "That's not Brian anymore. That's just a body." So about a lot of people don't know this, but I'll end it with this.
Yeah.
Around 2:30 in the afternoon on a Sunday, an Argentinian main doctor came in to check Brian's thing. So in Spanish, I told the Argentinian doctor, nobody could understand me. I said, "Hey," I said, "Look," I said, "you see that gentleman laying there?" I said, "We don't have the same mother or the same father, but he's my brother." The Argentinian doctor stopped everything he was doing and just stared dead into my eyes. I said, "My brother that's laying there right now," I said, he's not here with us. He's not here, is he?" And then he looked at me and I said, "You can tell me in Spanish because they don't understand what we're talking about. So you can tell me." I said, "He's gone, isn't he?" And then he looked at me and nodded yes. I said, "So let me ask you this. What's the point of keeping this machine slamming on his chest, making him breathe?" And he went, in Spanish, he said, "Well, that's the family's decision. This is the family's decision." So I said, "All right, so what you're telling me is that if we stop that machine, he's gonna go." And the doctor said, "Yes." He says it can take 10 minutes, it can take 30 minutes, it could take a day, it could take a week. And I said, "All right." I said, "Hey, you know what, man? I appreciate what you're just doing and what you just said to me. I appreciate it." And I shook his hand. And he said, "I'm sorry." He goes, "No." I said, "No, man." I said, "I appreciate it. You just made things right for me." And he said, "Okay." So as he walked off, believe it or not, the first person I turned to look at was his dad, Jerry Lawler. Jerry Lawler was staring dead at me, to my face. And King said to me, "Hey, Dale." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "What'd he say?" I said, "King, I love that man." I said, "I love you and I love the whole family." I said, he said, "Brian's not here with us." And now keep in mind, and I don't blame him for it. It was King's decision to keep him on the machine. And he wanted to keep him on the machine for who knows how long. You know what I mean? He said, "No, let's just wait. Let's just wait to see." But I remember,
Oof.
Yeah, it was a hard time. I looked at him and I said, "I'm sorry, King." I said, "Brian's not with us anymore. I'm sorry." And he told me, and he goes, "What did the doctor say?" He said, he told me that if we took that machine off, it'd just be a matter of time. And King looked at me and looked down and then looked at me again, looked at the rest of the family, his brother, his mama, his girlfriend. And I think the referee, what's his name? The old, man.
Jerry Calhoun?
Jerry Calhoun was there. He was there, exactly. Calhoun was there, and he looked at Calhoun, And he says, all right, let's take him off the machine. And I said, all right, King. I said, are you sure? He went, yeah, I'm sure. So we called the doctor back in, and I told the doctor, I said, look, man, the dad's made a decision. And then I looked over at King, and King went, yeah, like with his hands, he says, take him off. Now, I'm going to tell you something. So the nurses came in, and the doctor came in. He goes, all right, we just need Brian's family here, the mother, the father, and the brother. And I promise you, it was like the most kindest thing I've ever heard. King said, no, Dell stays. Dell's part of the family. And they took the machine. Everybody else had to go. Calhoun, everybody except me, his mom and dad, and Kevin. And they let go of the machine. They turned the machines off. Mm-hmm. And Brian was gone in about 80 seconds.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I mean, it went dee, 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 and then it went all the way down to like nothing. And I said, all right, you know what I mean? And it just felt like somebody punctured my heart, so it wasn't easy. It was difficult.
Man, I want to thank you for opening up like that. I didn't expect that kind of answer. I didn't know all of that information, so I'm so sorry to make you live that, but that was an amazing story, and I really appreciate you sharing it with me.
Absolutely, and I just felt that, that it was, time for people to understand, what happened. And at the end of the day, man, King doesn't, King may live, with the fact that, he doesn't know. See, the thing about it is nobody knows what happened. Nobody knows. You know what I mean? Sometimes I think that Brian tried to act like he was going to do something and it backfired. Who knows? Brian was on some medication as well, and they weren't giving it to him in the prison. So who knows? That might have had some type of effect on him that affected his psyche. Nobody really knows for sure. The horrible part is that he died so young, and he's not with us anymore.
Yep.
Over some stupid stuff, you know what I mean? But that was pretty much, what happened with Brian.
Well, I really appreciate that story. I know I've kept you a little longer than I said I would. I'll let you go with a couple quick questions, and then we'll be done if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
So kind of a light one for you. Are you surprised by the amount of positive nostalgia that pro wrestling has from the 80s and 90s, not your era, and the even Memphis, and how people are looking back at it now and seeing how unbelievably groundbreaking. I know everybody looks back at the 70s era of USWA Memphis Wrestling, but it was still really cutting edge well into the 90s. Are you surprised with the nostalgia? Yeah.
It was cutting edge. Wait, till the end. 97, I believe. Was it 96 or 97 that
97,
it
97.
Yeah. No, it was cutting edge all the way till then. I mean, you remember even, we still had guys coming in that, for Glenn Jacobs, who I worked 1,000 times as he was Doomsday at the time, but it was the same thing as Kane. It was the same. It was almost the same character. You know what I mean? He was.
When we've been talking about the Magic, I keep thinking about Glenn Jacobs when he did the thing where he shot lightning from his fingertips and set the guy on fire, and I thought, that's something you probably could have done with the with the character.
Yes. And Glenn was a great guy, and like I said, we worked a bunch of times and had fun with it. You know what I mean? But it was everybody. Everybody that worked in New York, which is what we called WWF at the time, worked the territory as well. They were going back and forth.
Yep. Even Brett was in back and forth a couple times. I have On my wall beside me, believe it or not, I have a signed Macho Man USWA program. When Macho Man came in, I think it was 93. So, I mean, there's a lot of guys that came back and forth.
That's right. I think he was working Jeff and King at the time.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And Macho was a real good guy as well. You know, see all these guys. That's the crazy thing now. You know what I mean? I remember being in the dressing room. To my left was Jeff Jarrett. To my right was, you know, Brian Christopher. Bill Dundee was over here. Rock and Roll Express, the Midnight Express, you name it. Paul Diamond. All these guys all over the place. Now, you know, it's not the same anymore. You know what I mean? It's totally different people all the time.
Yeah, I agree.
Know, so that was and that was the camaraderie we had back then, man. We knew it. It was like a family.
Absolutely. All right. Well, like I said, the way we started the interview is kind of the way we're going to end the interview, and that's talking a little bit about the action figure. The action figure's coming out soon. I can't wait to get my hands on it. It's in the old Hasbro style. For those who grew up in the early 90s, that's the style that they're going with. It's from the Ringmaster Series 2, and it's Spellbinder. Is it cool to think that, 30-plus years after you started the wrestling journey, they're still making toys for you?
Yeah, man. I think it's cool, man. You know what I mean? Here's one thing. Thank God I had enough sense to keep myself in shape, and I'm still in the gym 5-6 days a week and stuff. Because when they started calling me, they inducted me into the Memphis Wrestling Hall of Fame, and then they once Randy Hales called me and said they were going to do that. I started getting a string of calls that I want to do this appearance, that I want to do that, and I said sure. And when I came in, the greatest compliment I've ever had was about 3 months ago. I did an appearance for Carl Perkins Child Abuse Center, and they wanted the Spellbinder, so I got in my gimmick and stuff like that, painted my face, and went out there. And I was in the back, about to walk out, and there's a gentleman. Oh my gosh, I can't think of his name now, but he had been around. I had seen him around. Oh, he was a photographer, and he had been around the Mid-South Coliseum, all the territory for years. And I remember seeing him and saying, "Hey, man, what's happening?" "Hey, Spell." He goes, "Spell," and I said, "Yeah." He goes, "You look like you walked out of TV 20 years ago." And I thought, man, thank you so much. You know what I mean? But in my mind, I'm thinking, good Lord, I'm glad I stayed in the gym. You know what I mean? 'Cause a lot of the guys stop doing what they're doing, and then you go, man, what happened to them? And that's like my biggest fear. So I want to look like my action figure. I don't want them to go, man, he don't look nothing like that action figure.
Well, I'm a big rock and roll fan. Yeah, I'm wearing a KISS shirt on my profile picture that I messaged you with. And, yeah, I think those guys probably benefited from the makeup. I don't think they necessarily worked out, but the makeup might have helped a little too, though.
I thought, to be honest with you, talking about them, because I was a big fan of them, when they took the face off, I think it took a little bit from their character.
Well, history repeats itself. They're going to do a show in a couple months, and guess what they're doing? No makeup. They're back together and no makeup again. Yes, sir.
Awesome.
History repeats itself, I guess,
For sure, man.
Well, I thank you for taking the time and for bearing your soul with that Brian Christopher story. That was unbelievably amazing. I thank you for sharing all that with me.
Absolutely.
Let me tell you something kind of between you and I.
Yeah.
I'm going to be on Dark Side of the Ring next week. For like 10 seconds, I'll be on for 10 seconds. But those guys contacted me for something. If they do a episode on Brian Christopher, should they be reaching out to you? Would you want them?
If they want to know the truth, they would reach out to me, because none of them was in that room. And none of them got the call like I did. None of them knew Brian like I did. I've seen some of these dark sides of the ring, and I've known a few of these guys very well. And a lot of these guys don't know what they're talking about, I'll be honest with you. I look at them and go, where'd they get that from? Yeah. No. If something like that ever comes up about Brian, they need to talk to me if they want to know the truth. If they want to know everything, because, you could ask his dad himself. Nobody knew Brian like me. And nobody spent more time with Brian than me. Nobody. It's like I said, King knew the deal. You know what I mean? Put it this way. Whenever we went on the road, King would say, whose car are we taking? Brian's or yours? If he was talking to me. He knew. You know what I mean? It was us three.
That's amazing. All right. Well, if that ever comes up, I'll definitely send them your way. I'm by no means like on first name basis with those guys or anything, but if they ask me, I will definitely point them in your direction.
Absolutely, brother. Anything you need, just feel free. You got my number and you got my Facebook.
I appreciate you, man. That was amazing. Thank you for the time, and I'm sorry for taking so much more than I said I would.
You're fine, man. You're fine. My wife hasn't got back yet, so we're good.
All right, I was going to say apologize for me, but I guess she doesn't. She won't know any better, so that works.
No. All right, brother. Have a good night.
Talk to you later. Thank you. Have a good time. Bye-bye.